January 22, 1945. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow fell in silence, thick, oppressive, blanketing the corpses and the shattered steel alike. In the frozen woods surrounding Bastogne, a German panzer grenadier crouched behind the blackened hull of a Panther tank, its turret twisted at an unnatural angle. His breath came in shallow clouds. His fingers, stiff with cold, gripped the stock of his carabiner 98K. Around him, the forest was a graveyard of ambition. Trees snapped like matchsticks, foxholes filled with ice and blood, and everywhere, the acrid stench of cordite and burnt rubber. He had been told this would be different, that the Americans were soft, that their lines would crumble, that by Christmas the war would turn. But it was not Christmas anymore, and the Americans had not crumbled. What haunted him most in those final hours of the Bulge was not the cold, nor the hunger, nor even the knowledge that his comrades were dying in their hundreds. It was the sound, that sound, a low, distant whistle that grew louder, sharper, until the earth itself seemed to scream. Then the impact, a detonation so precise, so devastating, that it felt less like warfare and more like the hand of some omniscient God reaching down to pluck individual men from existence. The Americans called it artillery. The Germans, in those desperate weeks, called it something else. Vernichtung. Annihilation. The Wehrmacht had come to Bastogne expecting to face a broken, demoralized enemy. What they found instead was a demonstration of industrial might and technological precision so overwhelming that it shattered not just their offensive, but their understanding of modern war itself. In the autumn of 1944, the German High Command looked at the map of Western Europe and saw a narrow window. The Allies had overextended themselves. Their supply lines stretched thin from the beaches of Normandy to the German border. The American and British forces, exhausted from months of grinding combat, were scattered across a front that ran from the North Sea to the Swiss Alps. In the forests of the Ardennes, in that quiet, hilly sector held by green American divisions resting and refitting, Adolf Hitler saw an opportunity. One last gamble. One final stroke of genius to split the Allied armies, recapture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, was born from desperation and delusion in equal measure. Hitler believed that the Americans, in particular, lacked the stomach for a prolonged fight. They were a nation of shopkeepers and farmers, he thought, not warriors. Their army was a mongrel collection of conscripts who cared more for comfort than conquest. Their equipment, though plentiful, was inferior to German engineering, and their commanders, untested in the brutal arithmetic of the Eastern Front, would panic when confronted with a true blitzkrieg. On December 16, 1944, 3 German armies, more than 200,000 men, supported by over 1,400 armored vehicles and assault guns, smashed into the American lines along an 80-mile front. The initial assault was devastating. Entire regiments were surrounded. Command posts were overrun. Roads clogged with retreating vehicles. In the chaos, it seemed for a moment that Hitler's gamble might pay off. But there was one problem, one critical miscalculation that would unravel the entire offensive. The Americans could shoot back, and they could shoot with a precision and lethality that the Germans, for all their experience, had never encountered. Artillery had been the king of battle since the trenches of the First World War. Entire landscapes were reshaped by it. Entire generations were swallowed by it. But by 1944, the nature of artillery warfare had evolved in ways that the German army, for all its tactical sophistication, had failed to fully grasp. The Americans had not just built more guns, they had built a system, a vast interconnected apparatus of forward observers, fire direction centers, radio networks, and logistical chains that turned the act of delivering high-explosive shells into something closer to industrial production than traditional combat. At the heart of this system was the M114 150 mm howitzer, the workhorse of American field artillery. It was not a weapon of elegance or aesthetic beauty. It was squat, utilitarian, designed to be mass-produced and easy to maintain. But what it lacked in grace, it made up for in devastating effectiveness. With a maximum range of just over 14 kilometers, it could hurl a 95-pound shell across vast distances with shocking accuracy. And the Americans had thousands of them, but the gun itself was only part of the equation. What truly set American artillery apart was the system that controlled it. Every artillery battalion was equipped with forward observers, men who crept to the front lines, sometimes into no man's land itself, to spot enemy positions and call in fire missions. These observers were connected by radio to fire direction centers, where teams of men, armed with slide rules, charts, and logarithmic tables, calculated trajectories, wind speeds, propellant temperatures, and 100 other variables in a matter of minutes. The result was a level of precision that turned artillery from a blunt instrument into a surgical tool. The Germans had artillery, of course, plenty of it. The 105 mm H-18 and the 150 mm H-18 were excellent guns, respected by their crews and feared by their enemies. But German artillery doctrine remained rooted in the decentralized, mission-oriented tactics of the Auftragstaktik tradition. Batteries operated with considerable autonomy, supporting local commanders as needed. Coordination across multiple battalions was possible but difficult. Massing fire from dozens of guns onto a single target required time, planning, and good fortune. The Americans, by contrast, had perfected the art of massed fires. A single forward observer could call in not just his own battalion, but multiple battalions, sometimes entire divisions of artillery, onto a single grid coordinate. This tactic, known as a TOOT, or time-on-target mission, synchronized the firing of dozens of guns so that their shells arrived simultaneously, denying the enemy even a second's warning. The effect was apocalyptic. At Bastogne, the Germans would learn this lesson in the harshest way imaginable. Bastogne was never supposed to hold. It was a small market town in southern Belgium, a crossroads of no particular strategic importance except for one fact. 7 paved roads converged there. Control those roads, and you controlled the movement of supplies, reinforcements, and armor across the entire region. When the German offensive began, the 101st Airborne Division, paratroopers rushed into the line with minimal supplies and no time to prepare, was ordered to hold Bastogne at all costs. They were surrounded within days, cut off, outnumbered, low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The German commanders expected them to surrender. On December 22nd, a delegation under a white flag approached the American lines with a formal demand for capitulation. The response, delivered by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, entered history as a single, defiant word: nuts. But defiance alone does not win battles. What kept Bastogne from falling was not just the courage of the paratroopers in their frozen foxholes, but the thunder that rolled in from the fields beyond the German lines. American artillery, relentless, unyielding, terrifyingly accurate. The 101st was supported by elements of the 10th Armored Division and, crucially, by multiple artillery battalions that had managed to fight their way into the perimeter before the ring closed. These included the 321st, 333rd, 755th, and 969th Field Artillery Battalions, among others. Together, they represented a concentration of firepower that the Germans had not anticipated. And then there was the 7th Corps Artillery, positioned outside the encirclement, but well within range. Even as the Germans pressed their attacks from all sides, these guns, miles away, firing over the heads of friendly forces, poured shells into German assembly areas, supply routes, and command posts with methodical precision. The effect was devastating. German infantry, massing for an assault, would be caught in the open by a sudden deluge of high-explosive shells. Tank columns, moving forward under cover of darkness, would find their routes cratered and impassable. Command posts, carefully concealed in farmhouses or forest clearings, would simply cease to exist, erased by shells that arrived without warning. One German officer, captured after the siege, described the experience in his interrogation report. "We could not understand it," he said. "We would observe an American position. We would plan our attack carefully. And then, before we could even begin, the shells would come. Not random, not scattered, but on us, exactly on us, as if they were watching from the sky itself." They were. The secret to American artillery accuracy at Bastogne was not just the guns, but the eyes. Forward observers from the artillery battalions had established observation posts on every piece of high ground around the perimeter. From church steeples, from the upper floors of farmhouses, from hastily dug positions in the snow, these men watched the German lines with binoculars and rangefinders. When they saw movement, a column of tanks, a concentration of infantry, even a single vehicle, they radioed back to the fire direction centers. What happened next was a marvel of coordination. The Fire Direction Center would plot the target on a map, calculate the range and bearing, and transmit firing data to the gun batteries. Within minutes, the first shells would be in the air. If the initial rounds were off target, the observer would adjust. "Right 50, add 100. The guns would correct, fire again, and walk their shells onto the target with brutal efficiency. But the true innovation was in the use of proximity fuses. Developed in secret by American scientists and deployed for the first time in large numbers during the Battle of the Bulge, the VT, variable time fuse, was a tiny radar transmitter embedded in the nose of an artillery shell. As the shell descended toward the ground, the fuse would detect its altitude and detonate the shell at the optimal height, usually about 20 feet above the target. This created an airburst effect, showering shrapnel downward over a wide area. Soldiers in foxholes, trenches, or behind cover found themselves exposed to a rain of steel fragments that rendered traditional defensive measures useless. The Germans had no equivalent technology. Their fuses were timed or impact-based, designed to explode on contact with the ground or after a preset delay. Against entrenched infantry, these were effective. Against dispersed or mobile targets, they were far less so. The VT fuse changed the calculus entirely. A single battalion firing VT-fused shells could achieve casualties that previously required an entire division's worth of bombardment. At Bastogne, the psychological effect was as devastating as the physical. German soldiers learned to dread the sound of incoming artillery. They learned that no position was safe, that no cover was adequate, that the Americans could reach them wherever they went. Morale crumbled. Discipline frayed. Units that had fought with courage and skill on the Eastern Front found themselves paralyzed by fear. The Germans expected mud and confusion. They expected the fog of war to favor them, as it had so many times before. What they did not expect was an enemy who could see through the fog, who could calculate their position to within meters, who could bring down fire so accurate that it seemed almost personal. On Christmas Eve 1944, the weather cleared. For the first time in over a week, the skies above Bastogne were blue, and with the clear skies came the aircraft, American transport planes dropping supplies by parachute to the besieged defenders below. But more importantly, the clear weather allowed the fighter bombers to join the fight. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs roared over the German lines, strafing columns and bombing supply depots. And up above, spotter planes from the artillery observation squadron circled lazily, radioing back the precise locations of German positions. The artillery, already deadly, became omniscient. German tank crews, accustomed to the relative safety of armored warfare, found themselves targeted individually. A Panther tank moving through a forest trail would be struck by a single, perfectly placed shell that penetrated its thinner top armor. A self-propelled gun, hull down behind a ridge, would be bracketed by shells that landed so close that the crew abandoned the vehicle in terror. Time and again, German commanders reported the same phenomenon. The Americans knew where they were. Always. In his post-war memoir, General der Panzertruppen Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, reflected on the Battle of the Bulge with a mixture of admiration and bitterness. "The American artillery," he wrote, "was the most effective I have ever encountered. It was not just the quantity, though that was overwhelming. It was the speed, the accuracy, the coordination. We could not move without being seen. We could not concentrate without being destroyed. It was as if we were fighting an enemy who could read our minds." There was a moment, recorded in the after-action reports of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, that captured the terror of American firepower with cold, clinical precision. On the afternoon of January 3, 1945, a German infantry regiment attempted to break through the American perimeter on the northeastern side of Bastogne. They moved in company-sized formations, using the cover of a pine forest to mask their approach. They were well-trained, experienced troops, veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived Stalingrad and Kursk. They did not survive Bastogne. A forward observer, Sergeant Harold Klein, spotted the movement from his position in a blown-out barn. He estimated the size of the force, roughly 800 men, and radioed back to the Fire Direction Center. Within 3 minutes, 6 battalions of 155 mm howitzers were ready to fire. The mission was designated as a TOT, time on target. The guns were synchronized so that their shells, fired at staggered intervals, would all arrive at the same moment. At exactly 1417 hours, the forest erupted. 144 shells, each carrying nearly 100 pounds of high explosive and steel fragments, detonated over the German regiment in the span of 10 seconds. The noise was so loud that American soldiers in the perimeter, over a mile away, felt the concussion through the frozen ground. When the smoke cleared, the regiment had ceased to exist. Survivors, and there were fewer than 50, stumbled back through the snow, many of them in shock, some of them missing limbs, all of them shattered. The official report listed German casualties as approximately 600 killed or wounded, remainder dispersed. The word dispersed was a euphemism. They had broken, they had run, and they had never come back. The Germans had expected to fight Americans. What they had not expected was to fight America itself, the vast industrial machine that could produce shells by the millions, that could train thousands of artillerymen, that could coordinate fire across entire armies with the precision of a factory assembly line. Every shell that fell on Bastogne represented a triumph of logistics as much as tactics. The ammunition had been manufactured in plants across the United States, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, then shipped across the Atlantic in convoys defended by destroyers and aircraft carriers. It had been unloaded at ports in France and Belgium, transported by truck and rail to forward supply depots, and finally hauled to the gun batteries by 6-ton trucks that churned through mud and snow. The Americans fired, on average, over 20,000 shells per day during the siege of Bastogne. Each one had traveled thousands of miles to reach its target. This was not war, as the Germans understood it. This was industrialized violence on a scale that rendered individual courage almost irrelevant. A German soldier could be brave, disciplined, and skilled, and still die because an American teenager in a fire direction center 10 miles away had plotted his coordinates correctly. The symbolism was inescapable. The Germans had wagered everything on the superiority of their will, their tactics, their ideology. They believed that a lean, hardened army of true believers could defeat a soft, materialistic democracy. At Bastogne, That belief died under a rain of steel. By the end of January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was over. The German offensive had failed. Their armies, battered and depleted, retreated back across the German border. The Wehrmacht had lost over 100,000 men, thousands of vehicles, and any hope of reversing the tide in the West. The Allies had suffered heavily as well, over 80,000 American casualties. But they had held. And in holding, they had revealed a truth that would echo through the final months of the war. The Americans were not soft. They were not weak, and they were not going to lose. In the years after the war, historians and veterans would debate the reasons for the German defeat at Bastogne. Some pointed to the weather, which had grounded the Luftwaffe and exposed German columns to air attack. Others cited the stubbornness of the American paratroopers, who refused to yield even when surrounded. Still others noted the eventual arrival of Patton's Third Army, which broke the siege and turned the tide. But the soldiers who had been there on both sides knew the truth. It was the artillery, the relentless, pitiless, impossibly accurate American artillery that had shattered the German offensive before it could even begin. One captured German sergeant, interviewed by American intelligence officers in February 1945, summed it up with a bitter simplicity. "You could hide from the planes," he said. "You could hide from the tanks, but you could not hide from the guns. They found you wherever you were, and when they found you, you died." There is a hill outside Bastogne, marked now by a monument and a small museum. On clear days, visitors can stand at the top and look out over the rolling forests and farmland where the battle was fought. The snow is gone now. The craters have been filled in. The forests have regrown. But if you listen closely, on quiet mornings, you can almost hear it. The distant whistle growing louder, the promise of thunder rolling across the hills. The Germans came to Bastogne believing in the triumph of will over material. They left, those who left at all, with the knowledge that will, however fierce, cannot stop a shell traveling at 700 meters per second. They had fought bravely. They had died bravely. But bravery, in the end, was not enough. The American artillery at Bastogne was more than a weapon. It was a statement, a declaration that the war was no longer a contest of tactics or courage, but of systems and resources. It was proof that democracy, for all its inefficiencies and messiness, could mobilize its people and its industry to produce not just more guns, but better guns used more effectively, by men trained to a standard that the old military aristocracies could no longer match. The Germans had believed themselves masters of the modern battlefield. At Bastogne, they learned otherwise. The Americans did not outfight them. They outcalculated them. They outorganized them. They outproduced them. And they did it with such overwhelming mathematical precision that resistance became futile. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, a generation of German soldiers learned what their leaders had refused to believe, that the future of warfare belonged not to the bold or the brave, but to those who could see farther, strike harder, and endure longer than their enemies. They learned that America's strength lay not in the courage of individual soldiers, but in the vast, unstoppable machinery of a nation fully mobilized for total war, and they learned it one shell at a time. The legacy of Bastogne lived on long after the guns fell silent. In the decades that followed, the lessons of that frozen siege would shape military doctrine across the world. The importance of massed fires, of coordinated artillery support, of forward observation and real-time communication, these became the foundation of modern combined arms warfare. The VT fuse, once a closely guarded secret, became standard equipment for every army with the resources to produce it. But perhaps the deepest legacy was psychological. For the Germans, Bastogne marked the moment when the mythology of the Wehrmacht, the Rig, image of the invincible German soldier, the master of blitzkrieg, the heir to centuries of Prussian military tradition, finally shattered. They had thrown everything they had at a single objective, and they had failed. Not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked the tools to fight a nation that could turn war itself into an industrial process. For the Americans, Bastogne was proof of something else, that their way of war, often mocked as clumsy and wasteful, was in fact brutally effective. They had not tried to outthink the Germans. They had simply out-resourced them, out-organized them, and out-killed them. And in doing so, they had demonstrated that the future belonged not to warriors, but to managers, men who could coordinate logistics, analyze data, and apply violence with the efficiency of a factory line. In the end, the Battle of Bastogne was not decided by the paratroopers in their foxholes, nor by the tankers who broke the siege, nor even by the generals who commanded them. It was decided by the gunners, men whose names are mostly forgotten, who fired their cannons from miles away, who never saw the faces of the men they killed, but who did their jobs with such cold, mechanical precision that they broke the back of the last German offensive in the West. They were not heroes in the traditional sense. They did not charge into enemy fire or hold impossible positions, but they won the battle all the same. One shell at a time, one coordinate at a time, one calculation at a time. And when the war finally ended and the survivors went home, they carried with them the knowledge that they had been part of something larger than themselves, a vast, impersonal, unstoppable force that had ground an empire into dust, not through valor, but through sheer, overwhelming competence. That was the lesson of Bastogne. That was the lesson the Germans learned too late. And that was the sound that haunted them in their final days. The whistle of incoming shells, the thunder of American artillery, the voice of a nation that had learned how to turn abundance into annihilation. In the frozen fields of Belgium, beneath the snow and the silence, that lesson remains. A reminder that wars are won not by those who fight hardest, but by those who can fight longest, strike furthest, and endure whatever the enemy can inflict. A reminder that freedom, when mobilized, is not a weakness, but a terrible, awesome strength. And in the end, nothing could stand against it. Not courage, not skill, not ideology, nothing.